And we're very glad to welcome back and invite to the stage Steve Tam, who joins us from ACT Research. So a well-known friend and contact for us at Integer Research, but also I'm sure someone that many of you know and work with. Steve is one of the leading experts that follows the truck business. He follows trucks really closely. He joined ACT back in 2000, and he's currently one of the two principal commercial vehicle market analysts. So he follows every aspect of the truck industry. He's got a particular responsibility for certain things, like he tracks the used truck markets for ACT, and he also tracks the project and database management, involved in all kinds of regular work and special work for clients, but really one of the leading lights in terms of what's going on in the truck industry. And given that's where it all starts for DEF, we're very glad to have Steve with us. He's going to give us an update on what's going on in the market. Things have changed in the truck industry in the last 12 months since he spoke to us previously. So we're looking forward to hearing from Steve exactly where he thinks things are and what's coming next. So I don't see Steve. There you are. Steve, thanks again for joining us. It's always good to get your insights. So the stage is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Got a microphone working so you can all hear me? Good deal. And I'll probably wander around a little bit. I'll try not to get in the way of the screen, but you know, it's funny, Tim, in addition to all those things I did, when I started with ACT Research, we were in a chicken coop. It had been converted for human habitation, but there were 4 of us in there, you can imagine, each facing our respective corners. So by osmosis, not only do I know everything about all the areas that I'm supposed to be an expert in, I know everything about all the other things that, you know, apparently we have other experts in. So you're lucky to have me, right? For those of you who don't know ACT Research, our primary focus in life is forecasting production and sales for commercial vehicle equipment. We define that as classes 4 through 8. We focus primarily on the North American market, though we also do an outlook or a forecast for the China market. And then we're also partnered with a company not too far from your neck of the woods, LMC Automotive, who are up in Oxford. They have the onerous task of trying to do for the rest of the world what we do for North America. And I think they have less staff to cover those 35 or 40 other countries in addition to the 3 that we cover. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is help folks like you, people who participate in the industry, understand what's going on in the industry and what's driving it. So if I take a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today, as Tim mentioned, you know, it's the trucks that form the foundation for demand for the products and services that you offer. So we're going to take a look at population of trucks. What's the fleet that's out there? I've got some really good insights from some of the data that we collect on how far those trucks drive, which is a very important consideration in fuel and DEF consumption. We'll talk a little bit about fuel efficiency and kind of EPA standards. And then go a little bit further down the road, though I don't want to steal Tim's thunder for later on this morning. So, and then we'll talk about kind of the watch-outs or some of the gotchas, what we see as maybe potential headwinds for the industry and what the timing of that might be. And then lastly, looking a little bit further afield into the future and see what we lying out there. Now, I apologize. We're data hounds. We just absolutely love data. And so I've been told that sometimes this presentation or flavors of it are kind of like taking a drink from a fire hose. I don't know if you guys can see the picture over there, but there you are. There's the proverbial drink from the fire hose. It's good that you're going to have the presentations available later, so you can always go back and refer to them. It's one of my favorite slides. We've got a library of about, 3,000, and actually I love every one of them as if they were my own child. But this is a really good one. And the point or the takeaway of this slide, and I'm only looking back kind of at emissions-related trucks, is the stability in the marketplace. That's the point that I want to make. We get excited about a lot of the developments in the industry and how things are going to change, but over time, not a lot has changed. It's interesting to see the relationships, too, between the light and medium-duty vehicle industry as well as the heavy truck side. Oftentimes in this industry, we focus primarily on heavy trucks, completely forgetting that if you're doing that, you're kind of ignoring almost half the market potential. Now, that's not entirely true, because once you get down in those lighter GVWs, there are some non-diesel powered vehicles. I don't know what those people were thinking, but you know, there you are. So, and I'll kind of break that down for you too as we move through the presentation. Now, what I've done here, this is our Class 8 population. This is just in the U.S. market, and I've got 3 lines drawn in there. That top line is the total Class 8 fleet. So you got about 3.1 million trucks right now in the total Class 8 fleet. Since we're forecasting demand for new vehicles, we're not really interested in really old trucks that if and when they get replaced, probably won't be replaced with new vehicles, probably just newer used vehicles. So we look at that blue line, and that's what we call the active population. Those are trucks that are 15 years old and younger. That's our kind of our sweet spot. And again, you know, don't try to see all the detail, but what I'm trying to point out here is look at the stability. You can go back to kind of 2002, 2003 and see that that fleet hasn't changed much in size from that starting point to today. Now, there have been some, you know, some undulations in that line, right? Remember the 2005, 2006 pre-buy ahead of the 07 EPA mandate, and then, of course, followed by the Great Recession. So you get some shape in that line or in that population, but over time, fairly stable. And then I would also point out, if you take a look at our forecast, where we see demand for this space going, we will be adding to the fleet, which, of course, is good news for this customer base. So. Again, an eye chart or a detail slide, so don't try to write all those numbers down. The takeaway is, you know, we've got a breakdown, and I added Class 3 in here. Again, I said we focus on commercial vehicles. Look at the size of that Class 3 market. It's over 3 million units by itself in total. For us, though, from a commercial perspective, only about 20% of that space is actually commercial. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a diesel engine in it, right? You have a lot of retail customers or consumers, if you will, individuals like you and I who have that great big pickup truck on steroids with the, you know, the dualies in the back and whatnot. So again, part of your potential customer base, but not part of my universe. So I submit that for your consideration. I'm also showing you replacement numbers for the total and active fleets, as well as just kind of the average age, so you can get a feel for what that fleet actually looks and exists like. And so if you're looking on an annual basis, you're looking at somewhere kind of 400 and let's call it 50 to 500,000 units of churn or annual replacement. That's units that are falling out of service that have to be replaced by new units coming in. So a lot of good demand, because most times those units that are falling out are old and may not necessarily be SCR compliant engines. Is the takeaway. I mentioned I'd break it down for you, trying to get to the diesel piece. So if you focus down on that purple line or the purple bars for each of those cohorts, that gets you down to our estimate of what the population is of diesel-powered vehicles from Class 3 to Class 8 in the U.S. market. And if I do a quick math, 2.6, almost 3.5, between 3.5 and 4 million units in the fleet today powered by diesel engines. A very sizable market for demand for DEF. There's a misconception in our industry that every Class 8 truck on the road goes at least 100,000 miles a year. It's kind of a la Smokey and the Bandit, for those of you who might understand the reference. You know, you're running Coors beer from Colorado to everywhere that, you know, back in the 70s they couldn't export it to. And you did that, you know, hopped up on amphetamines. You know, you got in the truck and you drove with a load until you got to where you're going. Hours of service meant nothing to anybody, didn't exist. The reality of the situation, if you take the total Class 8 market, and that's not just tractors, but that would include vocational vehicles as well, so cement trucks and dump trucks and refuse vehicles and that sort of thing, on average, they're not even traveling 80,000 miles a year. Some of the best-in-class tractor companies can do that, so the Knights and the Hunts and the Swifts of the world, they can get that kind of utilization. And of course, if you put a second driver in the vehicle, you can blow that out of the water. But the dump trucks, you know, those work trucks, those guys are going 45,000 miles a year, 50,000 miles a year. They're not going nearly as far. And the day cabs, the tractor day cabs, typically it's not about how far you can go, it's about how many stops you can make as you're picking up and delivering along your route. I've also given you a breakdown for the light and medium vehicles, and in general you see that about 20,000 miles a year, give or take, is a good bogey for them. This data, by the way, comes from our used truck database, which Tim mentioned. That's one of the things that I focus on. We've got real-world observations of vehicles that are out there doing the work. And so when they get sold, we know how many miles they've got on them, and we know when they were built, we know how long they've been in service. So we have a good sense at a macro level of how they're actually working in the field, how they're accumulating mileage. We were having a conversation last night. I forget who I was talking with, but we were talking about, so what's the composition in that fleet of 2010 compliant, and kind of a breakdown based on that point. And you can see from looking at that pie chart, the light blue and green slices are EPA 10 and newer. So about half the fleet, and this is again active fleet, is EPA 2010 and compliant. So, and that's just Class 8 that we're looking at. So if you're looking at that 2.1, 2.2 million active fleet, about a million or so are 2010 and newer. And of course that number is getting bigger every day as we talk about replacement, the older trucks falling out, being replaced by the new trucks cycling into the marketplace. And then you can see our estimates on fuel economy, how folks are doing. It's really difficult today to walk into a dealership and order a truck where you cannot get at least 7.5 miles to the gallon. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. If you're a flatbed hauler, I'm sorry about your luck. But if we're talking about a dry van that's maxing out at 80,000 pounds GVW, 7.5 is easy. You can, if you're judicious, probably get 8 miles to the gallon and maybe even a little bit more. And of course, you've all heard about the Super Truck program. We've exceeded the 10-mile per gallon fuel consumption rate. So we'll talk about fuel consumption and what that means for this space in just a few slides. So. In fact, we'll talk about it right now. How's that sound? This is data that comes out of the Federal Highway Administration, and I'm not looking at just commercial vehicles or just trucks here. I'm looking at the whole shooting match. So I've got everything from motorcycles to Class 8 trucks included in that. I'll break it down a little bit finer for you as we roll along here. But it's a little bit of a spaghetti chart over the last 10 years looking at what's happening with the fleet, so the total number of vehicles that are out there in operation, how many miles they're traveling, the VMT or vehicle miles traveled, what fuel economy is doing, and this would be corporate fuel economy across this whole population, and then also, by extension, fuel consumption. And you can see in general, everything except fuel consumption is growing, and of course that's because of the fuel efficiency standards that we've had regulated into not just our industry, but the light vehicle industry as well. But it's interesting because one side of this data can make up for shortcomings or softness on the other side. What I've done in this next series of slides is taken that same data and just trended it out for you over that same period. I've also given you kind of the numbers that we're talking about. So from 2009 to 2016, the vehicle fleet has grown from 246 million to almost 270 million vehicles. And again, that's everything from motorcycles to Class 8 trucks. In terms of vehicle miles traveled, an increase from about 3 trillion miles here in the U.S. to about, let's call it 3.2 trillion miles. Now you can see, and the point of the trend line is to show you how these variables are growing in relationship to each other. So the number of vehicles has got the sharpest slope, or the fastest growth rate over that time period. Vehicle miles growing at a little bit slower rate, so that suggests, fewer miles per vehicle. And you can see where we're going with this, right? Fuel economy, for all the regulation that we've got in place and all the consternation that it's caused, not just in our industry, but in past car industry, they've gone from 17.8 miles to the gallon to 18 miles to the gallon. No telling with the current administration what's going to happen there. We may take a pause for the cause, or the vehicle manufacturers might stay on their high horse, their moral high horse, and continue to march. That's where my camp votes, but we'll see what happens. But you can see there's not a lot of improvement, not a lot of growth in fuel economy. And then in terms of then fuel consumption. Now, I have full confession, this is on a per vehicle basis. So it's a mix of better fuel economy as well as fewer miles being traveled. But it's the only metric on that chart that's not growing, even though we actually have increased fuel consumption if you measure total gallons from about 35 billion gallons to, I guess, north of 41 billion gallons of fuel. So that, kind of the good news, bad news story there. We're using more fuel, which implies we're using more DEF, but at a slower growing rate. I told you I'd break it down and just look at the trucks piece. And again, this is not just Class 8 trucks. If it's defined as a truck in the space, so everything from a half-ton pickup truck all the way through Class 8, you can see what's happened with that population or what its growth rate is. But then you can also see the consumption of diesel fuel. And that is not on a vehicle-adjusted basis. That's total gallons of diesel fuel consumed. So pretty healthy growth, really, if you're looking at it during that time frame, is what I'd like for you to take away from those comments. So if we kind of pencil out the math a little bit, I think I called this connecting the dots, right? So here we go. We've got population. We talked about that. Have a good sense of where it is right now and where it's likely headed, as well as on the vehicle miles traveled side. I think we know where we're going. Fuel efficiency, we talked about that. It's, in all likelihood, going to continue to improve. I don't think we're going to let up on that. Maybe the rate of improvement will slow, but nonetheless, it seems to be the right thing to do. So then we've worked backwards or forwards, however you want to think about it, into the total fuel consumed. So I can put a big green check mark on all those. I got that assignment done, Tim. Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do now, that DEF dosing rate, I told you I didn't want to steal Tim's thunder. I didn't want to step on his toes. So he's going to pick up that portion of the presentation a little bit later on this morning, and I'm going to leave you hanging. You like my cliffhanger there? So there you go. Oh, let's talk a little bit about then kind of going forward. What underlies our assumptions about, yes, the fleet's going to continue to grow, and some of those other things, some of those other assertions that I made in the earlier part of the presentation. And I don't want to give you a forecasting 101 lesson, especially at 9 o'clock in the morning after being out in the heat for breakfast. So I'll try to keep it light, try to keep it simple. Replacement I talked about a little bit earlier. If we look at demand for vehicles in any given period, about 75% of what gets built or sold this year is going to be to replace trucks that are falling out of the population. So, quick back of the envelope calculation, you can do this at home. I think, I didn't put my other slide in there. GDP, each 1% change in GDP in the U.S. market means you're going to need about 10 or 12,000 more Class 8 vehicles to handle the growth that's associated with that. So if you've got replacement in the U.S. about 190,200 from that earlier slide, plus the percentage that I just gave you, you can do a quick back-of-the-envelope forecast and see where things are going to go. Regulation may always get in the way, and we'll talk about that here in just a minute. So this is kind of a short-term dashboard that we put together. What we're trying to do is get a sense of where the market is going to be going in the next, let's say, 6 months. And this particular tool, we developed it about a year and a half ago. We backcast it over, I think, 3 or 4 previous cycles in the industry to get a good mix of variables. You've got basically 3 groups. The top group is, and this is just for tractors, so the top group is kind of manufacturing or freight related. Or the manufacturing and economy related. The middle group is freight related, and then the bottom group are statistics from our databases, so production and sales and orders and that sort of thing. And then you're just doing a simple, did it grow, was it flat, or did it contract, and then a summation of that. And it's uncanny, you look at that rating, that top line rating back in December where we had 10 green lights, if you will. And think about what was happening in this space back then. The order board was starting to really pick up momentum, and it popped in December. It was very strong in December. And we've seen it tipple off a little bit. Now we've actually had our best record months in history for orders in July and August time frame. But we're very peakish in this industry right now in terms of where demand is headed, and I think this dashboard does a good job of indicating that. And again, I don't want to do an economic forecast this morning, but if I look at where our expectations for freight are and what's going on, part of the reason that we had such a great year in 2017 and we're continuing to have a very good year in 2018 is what's happened with freight growth. We went from kind of second quarter of 2015 to the second quarter of 2017 with zero freight growth. This is a little bit different measure than where I'm quoting that from, but if you look at the ATA loads index, freight, was just flat, no growth whatsoever, and it has exploded since then, and you can see our expectation is for a very strong 2018, and we slow a little bit in 19, but 19 is going to still be a very good year. This is Alex Wood's favorite chart. This is the spaghetti chart. Don't try to follow the line. I can't even follow the line, and maybe on a screen that big I could. I don't know. I'd have to get up there with my finger. The takeaway from this slide is we're measuring trucking companies' ability and willingness to purchase equipment. That's what we're looking at. And the two axes across the top, you're looking at their profitability, right? Are they making money or are they losing money? And then down the left-hand side is the value of used equipment. So as their profitability increases, and the value of used equipment increases, which in this case, I don't know why we did it on an inverse, but that's at the bottom, the more likely they are to buy equipment. So the farther you are to your right and to the bottom, basically the healthier the industry is. And you can see where we're at. Used truck prices, that's the gap. That's why it's at the bottom. The gap is pretty big. Well, that's because new trucks are so expensive, right? There's no news there. So we are in a pretty healthy spot in terms of that environment, and that's substantiated by I think the next couple of slides, orders. This is through July. If we look through August and even into the preliminary September numbers, oh my gosh, we're north of 53,000. 53,100 was the last tally. And that's the best record month for Class 8 vehicles in the North American history, in the history of the industry. Just insane. In fact, do we have any Top Gun fans in here? My favorite quote from that movie is Kelly McGillis telling Tom Cruise, "You won't be happy unless you're running Mach with your hair on fire." Well, there you go. Mach 2 with your hair on fire. That's where this industry really is right now. Nobody's laughing. Thank you. Yeah, it's okay. That was a joke. I was trying to be funny. It's a happy joke. It's a really good joke. So yeah. From a backlog perspective, so the backlog of business that we've got, orders for unbuilt trucks, again at unprecedented high levels. This is the July data. I'm sorry, I thought I sent the August data, but anyway, this was a tie, or just a few, like 50 units below the all-time record. We blew through that in the August numbers, and it's just crazy. You look at the backlog. I don't know if you hear these comments from working with your customers, or maybe even if some of you are truck buyers, you're hearing this. I'd like to order a truck, please, and the OEM says, third quarter next year, okay for that, for delivery? And they're not kidding. The high volume units, the most popular models, we're looking at third quarter delivery next year. So it's just incredible. Capacity is also one of the reasons that the industry is doing as well as it is right now. If you're a 100-truck fleet, if you can keep 90 or maybe 91 trucks on the road all the time, you're doing really well. There are going to be trucks that are broken down, they need to be fixed, or maybe they wrecked and have to be repaired, or trying to find drivers to get in those seats and keep the trucks running is a challenge. If you add on top of that what happened as a result of the ELD mandate, we tightened capacity even further. And so that's part of the reason that truckers are enjoying such good times right now. Profitability is high, right? We've got strong freight growth, and we've got a really tight supply of drivers and trucks available to be able to handle that growth. And so what does that do? Economics 101 says higher prices. We're going to have to pay them. Now the good news is, when you put ELDs in or have constraints that limit capacity like that, you see initially a productivity hit. But then as these truckers, who are really smart people, figure out the new rules and figure out how to operate under the new rules, generally they get that productivity hit back and maybe even gain a little bit of productivity along the way. That's the story that we're hearing right now. So full enforcement went into effect the beginning of April. So we're almost about 6 months from that time frame, and that's kind of when they're losing capacity. So we ought to see them start making progress then going forward from this point. And in fact, if you look at our expectations, we think by the time we get out to the end of 2019, we'll kind of be back into balance. But that also means, you know, it's going to take some of the punch bowl away from the party, right? Profitability is going to start to slow down a little bit. So they invest, right? They put in a lot of equipment, and now we have too much equipment relative to the amount of work to be done. So rates will drop, profitability will drop, and then subsequently investment in equipment also slows down. Slows down. I don't want to say drop. Oh, I popped.
What about the,
Sure.
there's a phenomenon you see with trucks on the road that a lot of companies, a lot of people that ship in that are looking for drivers. It seems to be a phenomenon. There's a huge shortage. Does that impact these numbers?
So the comment or the observation in question was, you know, really good times going on in the space right now, but everybody is complaining about how difficult it is to find drivers. We've actually, I don't think I have the slide in this presentation, we've actually added on the for-hire side about almost 25,000 truck driving jobs to the labor force since the beginning of this year. Now that's only, you heard me say for hire. I make that distinction because if you're a truck driver working for a private fleet, so if you're working for Anheuser-Busch, let's pick on them, your truck drivers, their jobs get counted in the brewery industry, not as truck driving jobs. And so we don't have visibility through the labor data to see that. But those jobs are actually more appealing jobs, and so the likelihood is that the for-hire guys, you know, that's maybe half of the jobs that we've added, but the private guys have added even more jobs. I'm humming. You guys picking up the feedback? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. They had a bagpipe player out there now. What, do you got somebody playing one of those fjord horns or something? All right, so where we think rates are going, profitability. We take a real close look at the spot rate and contract rates, particularly in dry vans, since that's such a large market, but other markets as well. And what we're measuring is kind of the gap between those two things. And if we push that gap forward about 5 or 6 months, it gives you a really good indication, as you can see from the fit in those two lines, where contract pricing is headed. So now keep in mind, even though we're showing it rolling over, it's still growing. It's just growing at a lower rate. And that's, if I wanted to summarize this whole presentation in like one line, 2018 and 2019 are going to be fantastic years in this industry. Things are going to slow down in 2020, but it's still going to be a very good year. It's not going to feel good going down, but it's going to be a good year. I mentioned regulation a little bit earlier in my comments. The one thing about regulation, in general, it does not change demand in total for commercial vehicles. More likely what actually ends up happening is it changes the timing of when that demand is going to be realized. I mentioned the 07 pre-buy. So if we look at greenhouse gas phase 2, what we think is going to happen there, 2021 is in essence going to be a non-event. Most of the manufacturers are already meeting this standard, which is, again, is another reason that demand has been so good in 2017 and 2018. Trucking companies want the most fuel efficient, the rational ones, want the most fuel efficient vehicles that they can buy. And so they're taking advantage of that equipment that's available today. 2024, in order to meet that standard, you know, we're going to basically just be adopting the existing technologies at greater rates than we are today. So things like the low rolling resistance tires, the aerodynamics, the trailer blades or trailer skirts and tails, that sort of thing. So not a huge cost factor, very little, if any, uncertainty related to the performance of any of that equipment, and actually a net positive payback on the fuel economy gains. And so truckers are not shying away from or shunning that type of solution. They're actually adopting it. When we get to 2027, in order to meet those hurdles, in all likelihood, we're probably going to be talking about waste heat recapture. If that's the case, you then reintroduce the elements that drive pre-buy activity. So we have hardware solutions, new hardware solutions on the truck. We have questions about the reliability, the durability, the fuel economy that are related with those solutions. and you've got the potential for a sizable price increase for that equipment to be compliant with that standard. Truckers are going to turn and run the other way. So look for 2027 to be a very tough year, but 25 and 26, on the other hand, are going to be a nice run-up. And then, of course, all that gets undercut by CARB, and where they ultimately shake out on ultra-low NOx. Right now, they want to try to do that 2024, given the current political climate and everything that's happening. There's some uncertainty as to whether or not that happens. If that happens, it may accelerate the timeline of the broader national economy because, again, California is such a huge piece of the economy. You can't have trucks that can operate, in California and trucks that cannot operate in California. There's no wall there. It's just a line on the map. And so many folks go into and out of California. I think I'm doing okay on time. I want to touch base then on a couple of the really kind of future technologies that we're looking at. You can't pick up any industry publication without hearing about autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles. My takeaway here is my tagline, the second line up there. We're going to see revolutionary change in this industry with respect to these technologies, but we think that we're going to see it at an evolutionary pace. Okay? You cannot buy a Class 8 electric semi today. It's not on the market. As much as Mr. Tesla and Mr. Nikola, all those folks would love to have everybody buy one of these, and they tell us every time they get an order for one, you cannot get one. They're still in the prototype testing evaluation phase right now. And those are the two least likely markets to adopt that technology out of the gate. The capabilities, the cost, the weight associated with these solutions is terribly impractical for Class 8 applications. Now, drayage at the port, okay, you can make that argument. You could probably make that work at least even from an economic case, but have you ever been to one of the ports? Raise your hands if you've been to a port and seen a drayage operation. Anybody want to comment on what the age of the trucks that they saw in the port? These things are, dirt belching, butt dragging. This is the oldest equipment in the industry. Remember those trucks that I told you about that are more than 15 years old? Guess where a lot of them work? In the ports. They don't buy new equipment. They can't afford to buy new equipment, even with subsidies in California. Okay, maybe with subsidies in California, it might work. It depends on how much money California wants to print. So that's going to happen slow. But it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen, and it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen in other segments. This is going to ultimately, I think, be a niche solution or a specialty focused solution that where it works, it's going to work very well, and it will be adopted. We just got done with a big multi-client study on vehicle electrification in the commercial vehicle space. And to kind of the punchline, if you will, 15 to 20 years from now, if you're looking at the classes 4 through 8 commercial vehicle market in the U.S., you might see adoption rates of 10%, maybe, as an industry. So 2 decades from now, maybe 10% of the new vehicles being sold into this space will be powered by electric. That, of course, makes the assumption that the technology continues to develop as the industry thinks that it's going to. So we bring that cost per kilowatt hour down. We improve the density or the capability of the batteries. You have a recharging infrastructure, and you have a national power grid that can support that recharging infrastructure. So there are a lot of ifs in there, a lot of assumptions. But the good news is that you've got time, right? You can watch this and monitor it and see what's happening. Autonomous doesn't really have an impact on, well, I don't know, maybe it does on DEF consumption. I haven't really thought my way through all that, but I would make the same kind of comments, the same character of comments on autonomous. First of all, none of the OEMs aspire to what's called level 5 autonomy, or taking the vehicle out of the driver, or taking the driver out of the vehicle, sorry. I saw a really good presentation that one of the OEMs did, and they summed the SAE standards out pretty well. Level 1 is no hands. Level 2 is no feet. I think level 3 was like no eyes. Level 4 was no ears, and level 5 was like no driver, right? So just lining it out that way. So, but the issue, of course, is that there's this, if you're talking autonomous, it comes with a societal expectation of 0 accidents, right? And every time one of these things bumps into a guardrail or something else, we hear about it on the national news, right? It's breaking news, and that's not even in industry publications. That's like CNN and Fox and all the popular outlets. So again, revolutionary change, but at an evolutionary pace is the takeaway. And then my last slide, I think, are just kind of forecasts, unit forecasts. I've got 2018 and 2019. I didn't put 2020 on there. If you look at that first bold line, the North America Classes 8 retail sales, so we see, kind of 315 this year, maybe 320 next year. In 2019, I mentioned it's going to drop off. That's going to be closer to kind of 265, 275, something like that. If I think back to replacement numbers, North American replacement is 225. So we're going to be above replacement, even though we're going to have a pretty sizable drop-off in our marketplace because of the party that we're enjoying right now. So the hangover is not going to be a very bad one, is the bottom line. And I think with that, yep, we talked about market size and population, and from our perspective, that's a green light. The fleets and demand for commercial vehicles right now, 2018, 2019, and really even into 2020, into the slowdown. In 2020, you might color that a little bit yellow, but certainly not bad. And then in terms of market dynamics, things are running very well right now, and at least in the interim term, expected to continue to do that. So I hope, Tim asked me to kind of tell you what time it was or give you an assessment of the market, and I often fear that I've turned it into a watch-building exercise. But I hope I've given you some understanding of what we're talking about and how we think about it so that, if you disagree with me or you have other thoughts, you've got a starting point to be able to adjust from, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much.